In 1979, the Soviet Union sent its army into a distant, mountainous country called Afghanistan. What was meant to be a swift show of force spiraled into a decade-long conflict that would become the Soviet Union's Vietnam, a brutal, unwinnable war that would ultimately destroy an empire from the inside. This wasn't just another regional conflict. This invasion didn't just change Afghanistan, it changed the future of the Cold War and helped set the stage for the world we live in today. To understand why the Soviets made this fateful decision, we have to look at a map. Afghanistan sat in a precarious strategic position, a crossroads between the southern border of the Soviet Union, the oil-rich Middle East, and the rest of South Asia. For decades it had maintained a delicate neutrality. But in 1978, a violent coup brought a pro-Soviet communist government to power in the capital, Kabul. Almost immediately, this new government faced fierce opposition from religious and traditionalist rebels, known collectively as the Mujahideen. As the rebellion grew, Moscow grew nervous. The leaders in the Kremlin feared that if the communist government in Afghanistan collapsed, the instability could spill over into the Soviet Union's own Muslim-majority republics. They also believed, with some justification, that the United States was secretly fanning the flames of the rebellion, hoping to draw the Soviets into a trap. The Soviet leadership, led by Leonid Brezhnev, faced a critical choice: let a friendly government on their border fall, or intervene directly. Fearing the loss of a key buffer state and a blow to their prestige, they chose to act. On Christmas Eve of 1979, the order was given. Soviet tanks rolled across the Amu Darya River, and airborne divisions landed at Kabul airport. The 40th Army began its invasion. The war had begun. The Red Army, a military machine designed to fight a conventional war on the plains of Europe, expected a quick and decisive victory. They planned to secure the major cities, crush the rebellion, and stabilize the government within months. Instead, they walked into a nightmare. They found themselves facing an enemy unlike any they had ever encountered before. The Mujahideen were not a traditional army. They were decentralized groups of mountain fighters who knew the rugged, unforgiving terrain of Afghanistan intimately. They refused to meet the Soviets in open battle, where they would be annihilated by superior firepower. Instead, they perfected the art of guerrilla warfare. They would strike in sudden violent ambushes, targeting Soviet convoys winding through narrow mountain passes, and then melt back into the landscape. They hid in a network of caves, remote villages, and inaccessible valleys. For Soviet soldiers, the enemy was everywhere and nowhere at once. Every rock could hide a sniper, every village could be a rebel stronghold. The Soviet military, with its heavy tanks, artillery, and rigid doctrine, was completely unprepared for this kind of asymmetrical conflict. The war quickly devolved into a bloody stalemate. The Soviets controlled the cities and the main roads during the day, but the countryside and the night belonged to the Mujahideen. As the Soviets became more deeply bogged down in this quagmire, the United States saw a golden opportunity. This was their chance to give the Soviet Union its own Vietnam, a costly, demoralizing war that would bleed the superpower dry. But they had to be careful. Direct American intervention would risk a global nuclear war, so they decided to act from the shadows. Through a covert program codenamed Operation Cyclone, the CIA began funneling billions of dollars in weapons, cash, and training to the Mujahideen. The pipeline ran through Pakistan, whose intelligence agency, the ISI, became the primary distributor of this aid. At first the weapons were simple: rifles, mortar, and rocket-propelled grenades. But as the war dragged on, the Americans decided to escalate. They introduced a weapon that would change the entire dynamic of the war: the FIM-92 Stinger missile. The Stinger was a shoulder-fired, heat-seeking anti-aircraft missile. It was simple to use and incredibly effective. Before the Stinger, Soviet helicopter gunships, like the feared Mi-24 Hind, had ruled the skies of Afghanistan. They were the Red Army's most effective weapon against the guerrillas, hunting them down in the mountains with impunity. With the arrival of the Stinger, that advantage vanished overnight. Suddenly, a single Mujahideen fighter hiding on a hillside could shoot down a multi-million-dollar Soviet aircraft. The sky, once a safe haven for the Soviets, became a death zone. Helicopter losses mounted dramatically. The psychological impact was immense. The Soviets lost control of the air, and their ability to supply their remote outposts and respond quickly to attacks was severely crippled. The human and financial toll of the war was staggering. Officially, over 15,000 Soviet soldiers lost their lives. Hundreds of thousands more were wounded, physically and psychologically scarred by the brutal conflict. The war became known as the Bleeding Wound. Back home, the true cost was hidden from the public by state censors, but stories of the zinc coffins returning from Afghanistan began to spread. For the first time since World War II, the Soviet people began to seriously question their government's actions and its competence. For Afghanistan, the cost was catastrophic. It's estimated that over 1 million Afghan civilians were killed. Millions more were forced to flee their homes, becoming refugees in neighboring Pakistan and Iran. The country was devastated, its infrastructure destroyed, its society torn apart by a conflict fueled by superpowers. The war drained the Soviet treasury at a time when its economy was already stagnating. The billions spent on fighting in Afghanistan were billions that couldn't be spent on consumer goods, healthcare, or fixing the crumbling Soviet system. The empire was cracking from the inside. The morale of the army plummeted, and discontent grew within the Soviet population. By the mid-1980s, a new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, came to power. He recognized that the war was a political and economic disaster that was undermining his efforts to reform the Soviet Union. He was determined to end it. In 1988, after years of painful negotiations, the Geneva Accords were signed, paving the way for a Soviet withdrawal. On February 15, 1989, nearly 10 years after the invasion began, the last Soviet soldier, General Boris Gromov, walked across the Friendship Bridge back into Soviet territory. The Red Army was leaving Afghanistan in defeat. They had failed in all of their objectives. The pro-Soviet government they left behind would collapse a few years later. The Soviet Union had lost. The defeat in Afghanistan was a profound humiliation for a global superpower. It shattered the myth of the Red Army's invincibility and exposed the deep weaknesses within the Soviet system. The political fallout, combined with the immense economic strain, accelerated the forces that were already pulling the USSR apart. Just 2 years after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, in December 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. The Cold War was over. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was a monumental miscalculation. It was an attempt to project strength and secure a border that instead unleashed a chain of events that led to the empire's own destruction. It was a war of choice that proved fatal. A conflict meant to expand power that, in the end, destroyed it. This was the war that brought a superpower to its knees. The story doesn't end here. The collapse of the Soviet Union was one of the most significant events of the 20th century, and the war in Afghanistan was a major catalyst. If you want to understand the full story of how this once mighty empire finally fell, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. In our next episode, we'll dive deep into the final, dramatic years of the Soviet Union. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching.